This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 623 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. I sit on this show all the time and talk about how there are two major parts to Dynasty Fantasy Football. The first is actual player production. Of course, you need to have players who produce, because you need to score fantasy points. You can never lose sight of that. But the second part is one that I think goes ignored far too often, and that's the market and how players appreciate and value year over year over year. The way I see it, you eventually need production. You'll eventually need to score a lot of fantasy points to win a title. But all the while, you want your dynasty roster to retain as much overall value as possible year after year after year. It's sort of like buying a home. Yes, you want the home to do what you need it to do. Maybe you want 4 bedrooms for your family. Maybe you need at least 2 full bathrooms. That's your production. But you also want that home to gain value. You'd much rather have a home that does what you need it to do, all while gaining value with each passing year. And as I just said, I think the market value side of things, that gets ignored far too often. Most fantasy analysis is based on how sustainable a player's production is, when that same analysis should consider how sustainable a player's market value is. Today, we're going to completely push aside the production side of things. We're going to focus solely on the market. And by the market, I'm referring to average draft position, or in Dynasty, the value of a player during a startup draft. I ask questions about the fantasy football market all the time. I'm a nerd about this stuff. Those are my shower thoughts. Deal with it. One question that's been on my mind recently is, how do players rebound? But not on the production front. I'm not saying, hey, this guy really sucked this year producing. Is he going to bounce back? I'm asking this on the market front. If a player drops a whole lot in average draft position, does it matter? What does it tell us about that player's future market value? Because honestly, guys, the market is typically sharper than you think. We can utilize it to find edges, for sure. But the market isn't this irrelevant thing that we should completely ignore. So that's what today's study and episode is all about. I'm going to look at players who saw drops in average draft position, and I'm going to look at what happened next. And let me tell you, some of the numbers that you're going to hear today, they're shocking. They were to me, at least. Now, before we get into the study, soccer fans, this season, FanDuel and Captain Morgan are teaming up to give you a one-of-a-kind soccer contest. Introducing Captain Morgan's Soccer Pick'em, a weekly fantasy contest that's entirely free to play. The contest is simple. All I have to do is answer 10 questions about Captain Morgan and that week's soccer matchup. People with the most correct answers will earn their share of cash prizes. Head over to FanDuel and enter the Captain Morgan Soccer Pick'em today. Must be 21 years or older to participate. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app. Eligibility restrictions apply. And don't forget to make your game day more delicious and sub in the captain. Okay, so let's talk about this study. I really leaned on my friends at DynastyLeagueFootball.com for information here. You guys need to check out what they're doing over there, because you can uncover a lot of the trends that I'm talking about today. You can do it yourself. But this entire study was thanks to DLF's single quarterback average draft position data, which anyone can access. I looked at January data through the years, or since 2014, and I looked at what happened when players saw significant decreases in average draft position, or ADP. Because again, the question I'm asking here is, what happens to players when they see a dip in ADP? Do they ever rebound? Do they ever get their market value back? The problem going into this was that I didn't really know what significant decrease in ADP meant. If a player drops by 20 spots in average draft position year over year, is that a big dip? I mean, we have no idea without context, right? So what I did was I grouped players into buckets. I looked at what happened to a player's cost if it fell 10 to 19 spots, if it fell 20 to 29 spots, if it fell 30 to 39 spots, and so on. And that's in year-over-year average overall draft position, not positional ADP. So let's say a running back had an average draft position of 15 one year. If he had an ADP of 24 the next year, then he didn't hit the cutoff that I was looking for. If he had an ADP of 25, then he did, because he dropped 10 spots year over year. He fell into the drop 10 to 19 spots bucket. I also needed a cutoff for the type of player that I was analyzing with a study like this. Someone who gets drafted like 170th overall is probably going to be more prone to big fluctuations in ADP. And we also don't care that much about picks that deep in the draft. So what I decided to do was look at players selected in the top 100 of startup drafts. That way we're focused on the more important players in Dynasty. So we're looking at top 100 players who saw significant drops in ADP from one year to the next. Are we good so far? Everyone following? Okay, so the DLF ADP dates back to 2014. So that's where I started. I went from 2014 to 2015 to 2016 and so on, seeing where players saw drops in ADP of 10 or more, 20 or more, etc. The one thing I realized when doing this was that I couldn't just go all the way through 2021 because there's not a lot of data past 2021 because it's only 2022 right now. What I mean is the entire point of this study is to see how players rebound. So we have to give players enough time to actually rebound. If a player dropped 15 spots in overall ADP from 2021 to 2022, we have no idea how that player rebounded, or if he even did, because he hasn't even played in 2022. So I wanted to give players enough time to be able to come back from a drop in ADP, which meant I stopped at 2019. So from 2014 through 2019, I analyzed top 100 players in DLF startup ADP. And I specifically focused on players who saw drops in ADP year over year. I want to be very clear how I approach this so that everyone's on the same page before moving on. I know this isn't all that complicated, but it's better to over-communicate these things than under-communicate. The overall question here is what in the world happens to players when they see a drop in ADP? And more specifically, do players actually ever recover from a drop in ADP? Do they ever get back to their original average draft position? Let's take Trent Richardson in 2014 as an example, just so we're all thinking about this the same way. In 2014, Richardson had an ADP over on DLF of about 40. He was being drafted 40th overall in startup drafts, so he was a top 100 player. The following year, his ADP was about 157. So he fell roughly 117 spots in average draft position year over year. In the following years, so in 2016, 2017, and so on, Richardson didn't even have a startup ADP at all. So he never recovered back to his original ADP of 40. He actually never got back to his ADP of 157 either. Now, I broke down this data by position, and I want to start sharing this data by asking you a question. From 2014 through 2019, we saw 119 running backs drafted in the top 100 of startup drafts who then saw their ADP fall by 10 or more spots the following year. So some of these running backs saw their ADP fall by 11 or 12, others saw it drop more substantially. Wherever you're at right now, maybe you're in the car driving home from work, maybe you're at work trying to get your mind off of things, wherever you're at, I want you to guess how many running backs out of those 119 who saw their ADP drop by 10 or more, guess how many running backs were able to get back to their original ADP. So if a running back had an ADP of 30 and the next year it was 50, what are the odds that he eventually got back to 30? How many of the 119 running backs got to their original ADP? How many of them fully recovered? I'll give you a second. I'm sure a lot of you guys guessed something like 20. That 20 of the 119 running backs got back to their original ADP after falling 10 or more spots. Because 10 spots really is not that much. So there's got to be a handful of running backs in that 10 to 20 drop range who recovered, right? Well, what if I told you that the answer was 3? Because that's the answer. There have been 3 running backs in our sample out of 119 who saw a year-over-year ADP drop of 10 or more who were actually able to get back to their original ADP. One of those players was Derrick Henry, one was Dalvin Cook, and one was oddly Duke Johnson. That's it. Just 2.5% of our sample. Now, I started with the running back position here because it was the most dramatic. It is the most dramatic of any positions in this study. And I wanted you guys to get sucked into this study like I did. But I think this actually does make a lot of sense intuitively. If a running back drops in ADP by 10 or more, it's likely because he either had a bad season or he got hurt. No matter when that happens in a running back's career, chances are it's just going to be really tough for that running back to get back to his original ADP. Like take J.K. Dobbins. He had an overall ADP of 14 in January 2021. He had that type of ADP throughout last offseason. He then gets hurt and he misses the entire 2021 season. Then in January of 2022, he's got an ADP that's 26 overall. It fell by 12 spots despite his not playing. But that makes sense because number one, we don't know how well he's going to recover. But number two, he just missed out on a year of playing. We know those years are limited at running back. He's an extra year older, and we know that running backs often don't give us that much production after their rookie contract. So yes, based on that, it's highly unlikely J.K. Dobbins ever gets back to his ADP of 14. Getting back to that original ADP is what I'm calling a recovery. That player recovered and was able to get back to it. So 3 of 119 running backs recovered back to their original ADP after dropping by 10 or more spots year over year. What about the other positions? Well, in our sample of players from 2014 through 2019 who fell in ADP by 10 or more, we had 119 running backs, as I just said, 31 quarterbacks, 148 wide receivers, and 30 tight ends. So you're probably wondering what those recovery rates look like. Well, at quarterback, of the 31 who fell by 10 or more in ADP, only 4 of them were able to fully recover. That's a recovery rate of 12.9%. At tight end, it was 3 of 30, or 10%. At wide receiver, it was 10 of 148, or 6.8%. So running back had the worst recovery rate, but these numbers are pretty shocking across the board. It's very rare for any top 100 player in fantasy football to fall in startup ADP by 10 or more spots year over year and actually get back to his original ADP. So you're probably thinking now, okay, JJ, but what about players who drop by 10 to 19 spots versus players who drop by like 50 or more? There's got to be a difference there, right? Generally speaking, yes. If a player dropped by 10 to 19 spots in year-over-year ADP, he generally had better odds to get back to his original ADP than if he dropped by like 60 spots. For example, 2 of the 4 quarterback recoveries in this sample came from the 10 to 19 bucket. In the end, 33% of quarterbacks who fell in ADP by 10 to 19 spots were able to get back to their original ADP. So that wasn't too bad. When you look at the next tier, or quarterbacks who fell by 20 to 29, that rate falls to 25%. 30 to 39 was 14.3%. And then we've never seen a quarterback get back to his original ADP after falling 40 or more spots. And remember, these are all top 100 players by ADP. So if a quarterback had an ADP of like 70 and the next year it was 110, we've never seen a quarterback like that get back to his ADP of 70. At least not in our sample. At tight end, it's pretty similar. But in our sample, a tight end who fell by 30 or more spots never fully recovered. And running back was similar too, but with lower recovery rates. In our sample, 0 running backs got back to their original ADP after falling by 30 or more spots. 0. And only 6.3% of them who fell between 20 and 29 spots were able to get back to theirs. Of the backs who fell 10 to 19 spots, just 14% got back to their original ADP. And then with wide receiver, it was a little bit weird. We actually had 0 full recoveries of the 21 wide receivers who fell between 10 and 19 spots. But of the wide receivers who dropped 50 or more spots, 7.5% of them fully recovered. I think the main takeaway is still that if a player drops by 10 to 19 spots, it's still really bad news, but it's not as bad as if they were to fall by 30 or more. At least at the non-wide receiver positions. Another thing that was pretty evident in this data was that the higher the ADP, the tougher the recovery. If a player was ranked in the top 25 before his ADP drop, he had a much, much lower recovery rate. In fact, 0 quarterbacks, tight ends, and wide receivers who fell 10 or more spots after being ranked in the top 25 got back to their original ADP after falling. And only 1 running back did. Almost all of the movement happened after pick 25. Which makes sense because it's really hard for a player to maintain a high ADP. When he falls out of that high ADP range, chances are he's not going to climb back. Now, the last iteration of this that I wanted to share was whether or not a player recovered to his new ADP. In other words, if a running back started at an ADP of 70 and then he fell to an ADP of 110, does he ever get back to that new ADP? Does he typically get back to that ADP of 110, or is it just a free fall? To put this another way, I wanted to see if the 10 plus drop in ADP was the start of a trend. Perhaps it was a signal that the player would just never even remotely get back to his original spot. And generally speaking, that happened more often than not. In total, 45% of quarterbacks were able to maintain their ADP after the drop. So a quarterback fell by 10 or more spots, and he was able to maintain that new ADP 45% of the time. That was by far the highest of all positions. Tight end, it was 30%, wide receiver 24%, running back 21%. So what that tells us is that when a player at any position falls by 10 or more spots in startup ADP, chances are he's going to keep falling. It's not a guarantee. Players like Joe Mixon happen. But if you're playing the odds, you should bet on that initial drop being the start of a trend. Now, I just threw a lot of data at you. Let's quickly recap. Players generally don't get back to their original startup ADP when they fall by 10 or more spots in ADP year over year, no matter where they were drafted in the top 100. The degree in which they fall does matter. If a player drops by 30 or more spots, his odds of recovering are a lot worse than a guy who falls by like 10 to 19. But don't let that overshadow the fact that a drop of even 10 spots is typically the start of a bad trend at each position. It probably matters least at quarterback and most at running back, but it's a common theme for all positions in fantasy football. And we can use that knowledge to our advantage. We're going to have a list of players each year who fall by 10 or more spots in ADP. We can literally use that list as a starting point for players to trade away in Dynasty, and that's pretty cool. But I do want to add to that statement. You have to keep in mind what I said at the top. This is a study purely about market value. Players can still be productive despite slipping in market value. You just ideally want productive and appreciating assets in fantasy football. So from that perspective, I do think this study means a ton for a rebuilding team. When you're rebuilding, you should absolutely avoid players who have just fallen in ADP by 10 or more spots. You may see it as a buying opportunity because they're now cheaper, but chances are they're not going to appreciate in value. And when you're a rebuilding team, you care more about the market value than actual production. You need your team to get better year over year. But I don't think the players who drop by 10 or more spots are total avoids for everyone, because you have to keep in mind that player values reset. James Conner is a really good example of this. Back in 2019, he had a startup ADP of 19. That fell to 52 in 2020. So technically, that should have signaled that he wasn't going to get close to that ADP of 19 ever again. And he hasn't. In January 2021, that ADP fell once again to about 107. And then this past year, which to be fair, this ADP is before the new contract, but in January 2022, Conner had an ADP of 102. Just because Conner fell in ADP back in 2019 to 2020 doesn't mean that you absolutely need to avoid him now, at least based on this study. This is more about being reactive to the one season where that occurs. Though as I did share, typically it's the start of a trend for players. And of course, guys, this is not foolproof. Nothing in fantasy football is. Had you followed this method, you would have missed out on buying into Deebo Samuel or Cooper Kupp last year. It just so happens that the two biggest outliers within this method and within this data set, they occurred in 2021. That's going to happen though. Probably not to the same degree as Samuel and Kupp. And to be fair, wide receivers see bigger bounce backs than running backs do. But I don't think a couple of examples take away from the bigger picture here. And that bigger picture is that when players see dips in ADP, it is a bad sign for their future ADP. It may not be a bad sign for future production, but it's definitely a bad sign for ADP, for market value. And we know the two are correlated. So what's that mean for this season? Well, I think it's easiest to start at running back because we know those are the players who tend to get crushed by this the most. There are a ton of running backs who were in the top 100 last year who then saw their ADP fall by 30 or more in January 2022. Remember, in our data set, we never saw a running back recover from that type of drop. Those running backs in no particular order: Zach Moss, Kenyon Drake, Myles Gaskin, Chris Carson, Ronald Jones, Kareem Hunt, James Robinson, Miles Sanders, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and Josh Jacobs. Again, this doesn't mean that those players won't be productive or will never be productive again. It does tell us that they're highly, highly unlikely to ever get back to their original ADP. And the majority of those running backs won't even get back to their new ADP. So if you're rebuilding, I would consider each one of those players a sell candidate. Now, using that same filter for wide receivers, we get players like DeAndre Hopkins, Robert Woods, Juju Smith-Schuster, Laviska Shenault, Kenny Golladay, and Michael Thomas. There are even more of them, but I can't read all of them on this show. I'll plan on setting some information about this in my newsletter, though, so make sure you're subscribed to it by going to lateround.com. Now, the way I'd approach this is to then look at these players and then go back to dynastyleaguefootball.com and look at their trade finder tool. You can see recent deals that have gone down with the players that we're talking about. So with Michael Thomas, for example, there was a recent deal where he and Damian Harris were traded for Elijah Moore. Brilliant. That's the right kind of move to make in this environment, especially if you're more of a rebuilding team who needs assets to gain value. Elijah Moore is that kind of player. Someone also traded Josh Jacobs for Amon-Ra St. Brown. Again, if your goal is asset appreciation, then that is absolutely perfect. I talked all about how I view St. Brown on last week's mailbag episode, but he's likely to maintain decent value year over year, whereas Jacobs is unfortunately part of the group who fell 30 plus spots in ADP year over year. Josh Jacobs is unlikely going to see an ADP of what he saw in 2021 ever again. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't get Jacobs in redraft or anything. It's just taking advantage of the market trends in Dynasty. Now, I don't know about you guys, but this data was pretty eye-opening to me. The fact that these players very rarely get back to their original average draft positions, it does make sense. But at the rates that we saw, especially at running back, I thought that was pretty surprising. So moving forward, this should be part of our process. This should be something that we always keep in mind. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Again, big thanks to my friends at DynastyLeagueFootball.com for the data for today's show. Really, really appreciate it. Otherwise, everyone, I will catch you on Friday with the weekly mailbag show.